Today we'll explore how deforestation impacts indigenous communities worldwide, highlighting how historical, economic, and scientific systems shape land use. We'll connect theories from sociology and environmental studies to real-world indigenous experiences. We'll also examine the role of global systems in driving deforestation and discuss potential solutions. Deforestation continues at alarming rates worldwide, particularly in South America, Southeast Asia, and parts of Africa. Every year, about 10 million hectares of forest are cleared, mostly for commercial purposes. While population growth contributes, commercial agriculture, extractive industries, and urbanization are major drivers. Deforestation causes biodiversity loss and climate instability. But for Indigenous peoples, it also means loss of home, heritage, and self-determination. Indigenous communities are disproportionately affected, losing traditional lands, resources, and cultural heritage. These impacts are part of a global pattern linking economic systems to ecological harm. This sets the stage to examine the theoretical frameworks that help explain these processes. Modernization theory dominated post-World War II development thinking, claiming that traditional societies must modernize by adopting Western technology and economic systems. However, this framework often ignores centuries of colonial exploitation and justified deforestation, instead blaming countries for internal factors like population growth. Many Indigenous communities were labeled backward, their sustainable practices dismissed to make way for industrial agriculture and mining. When applied to deforestation, we see how global pressures for modernization push indigenous lands into commercial agriculture or resource extraction, often disregarding local ecological knowledge. Neo-Malthusians like Paul Ehrlich argue that population growth leads to environmental degradation. Malthus and Ehrlich both warned that population drives environmental strain, but the modern perspective adds consumption and technology. Yet ecological impact is not just about numbers. Consumption and technology matter. For example, North Americans have much higher per capita environmental footprints than rural indigenous communities, who often sustainably manage forests despite growing populations. This helps us see that industrialized societies cause far greater ecological harm than indigenous or rural communities. Indigenous populations often demonstrate how low-impact living sustain forests, challenging simplistic population blame narratives.
Deforestation is not always proportional to population growth. Comparing Oriente and Sierra shows that population alone doesn't determine deforestation. In Oriente, forests remain largely intact despite population increase due to sustainable practices and large forest cover. In contrast, the Sierra region shows intense forest loss from urban sprawl and pressure on limited land. This contrast highlights how political and economic systems, not just population, shape land use outcomes. Indigenous communities use relational frameworks to understand land and sustainability. Studies such as the Kailash of Pakistan show household-level forest management that balances human needs with ecological conservation through shared responsibilities that prevent overharvesting. Unfortunately, neoliberal market pressures often disrupt these practices, favoring short-term extractions over long-term stewardships. These practices contrast sharply with global market forces that see land as a commodity rather than a living system. Industrialization and the Green Revolution expanded food production but also accelerated deforestation. Mechanized farming and chemical-intense agriculture increased yields but also drove deforestation, transforming forest into monocrop zones, degrading soil and ecosystems. Small farmers, including indigenous communities, often bear the environmental and social cost, despite contributing minimally to global industrial output. This shows how modernization deepened inequality and environmental decline. Internal colonialism describes how certain regions thrive at others' expenses, often through state or corporate projects exploiting indigenous lands under the guise of national development. From mining in the Congo to the palm oil in Indonesia, indigenous lands are exploited for profit. Forests are cleared for mining, monocrops, or infrastructure, displacing communities and destroying ecosystems. These patterns repeat colonial structures of domination, using environmental degradation as a form of social control. Deforestation is thus both an environmental and social justice issue.
Indigenous environmental movements are increasingly global and interconnected, reshaping global activism. From North America to South America and Asia, communities mobilized to defend forests, water, and cultural heritage. Standing Rock united hundreds of tribes and allies worldwide, connecting indigenous sovereignty to climate justice. Across continents, indigenous leaders frame environmental defense not as charity, but as a right tied to cultural and ecological survival. These movements highlight the clash between short-term industrial exploitation and long-term indigenous stewardship. Neoliberal globalization prioritizes free markets and privatization over environmental protection, often resulting in deforestation for corporate profit. Transitional corporations clear forests for timber, oil, and agriculture under weak regulation. Indigenous lands are especially vulnerable. They are often privatized or sold, creating ecological debt that future generations must pay. An imbalance between short-term profits and long-term planetary health, threatening both biodiversity and traditional livelihoods. Research consistently shows that indigenous-led conservation outperforms state or corporate models. Recent studies reinforce that indigenous practices sustain forests, while colonial and industrial policies often undermine them. Combining indigenous and Western knowledge and risk assessments can reduce deforestation and protect ecosystems. Yet, global conservation often repeats colonial patterns by excluding indigenous decision-makers, perpetuating environmental injustice even in sustainability initiatives, marginalizing indigenous voices. Across continents, the solution is clear. Empower indigenous people to lead. Their land rights and ecological systems have preserved forests for generations. Global sustainability depends on valuing these systems equally with Western science and ensuring that development no longer comes at the cost of cultural and environmental survival. Solutions include legal recognition of land rights, sustainable land management, and integrating indigenous perspectives into international policy. Deforestation is not only an environmental crisis, but a social justice challenge. The long-term survival of forests depends on a shift in how societies value both people and nature.